So today, as I said, we're going to talk about my favorite lesson of the entire year. Introduction to part writing. We've talked a lot about how music is constructed from an analysis point of view. We've talked a lot about how chords work. We've talked about how intervals work. But we haven't talked a lot about how they work together as a composition and how you would go about putting them together. So someone said, are there rules for part writing? There are absolutely rules for part writing. And if you look at a standard music theory textbook that they use in college, then they're going to say these are the 87 practices, etc., follow these rules, blah, blah, blah. I think that's a terrible way of teaching composition. It's a very inorganic way of teaching composition. And I think that you can boil it down to a lot simpler and smaller set of principles to understand it. Do all composers use this, is what you asked a second ago. And no, but this figures into a lot of composition. So when we talk about these are what are called the common practices of the period, or this is sometimes referred to as the common practice period. And we're looking at basically late Baroque, early classical, from Bach to Mozart, in that general range of time. And a lot of what we look at is a four-part texture, something that Bach would have written for his church choir to perform. They're simple lines, and they interact with each other in very specific ways. This is quite different from, let's say, a pop tune or a jazz tune, where there's harmony parts that are pretty static and a single melody. So sometimes this is called counterpoint or contrapuntal music. And what that basically means is that there are four independent parts. So before we get too much deeper, I want to define a couple of terms. So when we're talking about counterpoint, in this case, we're talking about four independent parts. And that's important when we start talking about what can one part do and what can one part not do. It's because we want to keep it in terms of there being four parts. I also want to talk about motion and just define a couple of terms first. So we're talking about motion, we're talking about linear motion. So we can have parallel motion, which means same direction and interval. This is referring to two parts moving at the same time, in the same direction, in the same interval. So for instance, if you're thinking back to the hymns that we were reading before, This Is My Father's World, the soprano part and the alto part often move together. So if they're a third apart, and they both move, and they're still a third apart, we can refer to that as parallel motion. Because they're an interval apart, they move, and they're still an interval apart. Sometimes we can get really specific and say like, oh, well that's a major third and that's a minor third. That's not technically parallel because the interval shifts quality. Sometimes we use parallel motion to be general. When we're talking about is something allowed or not allowed, we're going to be very specific and say that true parallel motion has to be the same interval. So in this case, it would be they're a major third apart. They move and they're still a major third apart. Right? They don't have to move a major third, but the distance between the parts is the same. They move and they're still the same. Contrasting. Different direction. And interval. And of course, it's gonna be a different interval because it's a different direction. So they're here, they're one part, and then they move in opposite directions. So the interval will have to change. Similar. Same direction. Different interval. So same direction, they both went up. Here they're a third apart, here they're a fourth apart. Oblique. One part moves, another part doesn't. So one is static while the other one is moving. So those are different types of motions. Yeah?
So would it be like suspensions?
Suspensions can sometimes be oblique motions where everyone else is staying on the same and they're resolving down. Yeah, usually the resolution of a suspension is oblique motion. And sometimes the approach of a suspension is also oblique, where the suspension stays, everyone else moves, that's oblique, and then everyone else stays, the suspension moves, that's oblique too. Make sense?
Yes.
So those are our different kinds of motion as far as in reference to each other, in reference from one part to another. And when we talk about just singular part, just linear motion like one line, we can refer to a line can move either conjunct or disjunct. Quite simply, conjunct is stepwise. Disjunct is leaps. So with that in mind, rather than going through the 87 rules and practices of the Common Practice period, I'd like to introduce you to our cast of characters. If you know our cast of characters, and you know what they're supposed to do, then that will cover about 90%, 95% of all the rules and practices of not just the Common Practice period, but good part writing in general, even beyond that. So, we talked about this being in a chorale texture, in a chorale format. We talked about it being 4 independent parts. So what are those 4 parts? Soprano, alto, tenor, bass. That's our cast of characters. So if you know our cast of characters and you know how they behave, then that's going to definitely help you when you're composing. So, our soprano. Let's describe her. She's the topmost voice. She reads the treble staff, right? The topmost voice overall, the top note of the treble staff. The soprano typically is the melody. And we talked last time, melodies, are they primarily conjunct or primarily disjunct?
Conjunct.
They're primarily conjunct. Are they entirely conjunct?
No.
They're not entirely conjunct. So melodies include both conjunct and disjunct motion, but they are primarily conjunct. So these are all the characteristics of our soprano, right? Highest, treble staff, melody, conjunct, and disjunct. What can a soprano sing? Well, understand when we talk about her range, we're not talking about, oh, well, the queen of the night can sing. We're talking about common, right? And to put all of these in a focal point, these are the common practices. Does that mean that Bach never ever broke one of these rules? No, no. But this is the norm, right? Do you go outside of this? Yes. Does a good author occasionally write a grammatically incorrect sentence? Absolutely. Does a good author write every paragraph with a grammatically incorrect sentence? No, not at all. So as you're looking through these, don't get bogged down by the idea of rules and, oh, the man is keeping me down. I can't express myself, okay? No, these are this is your framework to exist in. And if there are exceptions, they should be the exception. That 1 out of every 50 times that happens. But the other 49 times you do what's standard, okay? So for the soprano's range, she gets an octave and a fifth. That's a big range. If you don't have a melody that can be accomplished within that octave and a fifth, you need to rethink your life. You need to take a good hard look at yourself and reevaluate that melody. So an octave and a fifth. Okay? Our next character, our alto. Let's describe our alto.
It's not the melody.
Okay,
Typically.
let's work our way in here. Soprano's the highest.
Oh, it's second highest.
Second highest, okay? Still reads the treble. Okay, not the melody. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. That in a typical structure, the alto is not the melody. Does that mean that the alto is less important?
No.
No, not at all. It just means that her job is different. You can be of equal value without being of identical purpose. Okay? You can be of equal value without being identical. Okay? So, what kind of motion are we looking at for the linear motion of the alto part?
Still primarily conjunct?
I would say almost entirely conjunct, and then Kate, you said
Static.
static even, right? Conjunct and sometimes even static, not moving, changing pitch at all.
And it's sometimes parallel with the soprano line, right?
Indeed, sometimes will act as a harmony line, countering counter melody to the soprano. So I'll put not melody, maybe I'll write harmony, and sometimes we can call it parallel support, okay? Moving parallel or similar to the soprano line. But in the stuff that we've looked at before, that's not gonna happen for an entire melody, right? It's gonna happen for a couple notes at a time. Because what would happen if the alto was parallel to the soprano the entire time?
It's just the melody.
It'd be like the melody. So, well, which one's the melody, right? So that can happen for a period of time, but not for the entire thing.